For the last podcast of the school year, and also my final appearance on the First Person podcast, I talk with Rob Parker and our web editor Rina Wehbe about Christine Love's Ladykiller in a Bind. Bringing together many of the discussions we've been having on the podcast this year, we discuss the representation of gender and the role of sex in the game. We also discuss the controversy of the removed sex scene during one of the final chapters, and the continuing discussion of visual novels and their mechanics. My name is Alexandra Orlando, and you can find me at AlexGOrlando.
Hi, my name is Rob Parker. You can find me on Twitter at RobotParking.
You're not going to say don't at me?
No, you can at me as much as you want.
Oh, okay. The DMs are open.
Yeah, no, DMs are still closed. just at me.
Okay, cool. So we're here today, and we're going to be anticipating another co-host here as we do our final first-person podcast of the year.
Well,
for some of us, ever.
At least of the academic year.
Yes.
Because then the fall will start.
Yes, that's right.
And then I think there will be more.
There will be more.
FPS will go on.
FPS will go on. Some of us are leaving, including myself, which the editorial will be up in 2 days, so this won't be the first you hear of it. Our podcast producer, Alex, which is another invaluable member of the team who will have someone to replace him, but he will be missed. And he's the one responsible for making the podcast work the way they have. That's amazing. And I'd like to take that time to thank him as well. And he's just nodding and smiling.
Yeah,
he has no mic.
Thanks, buddy.
Yeah. So housekeeping out of the way, today we are going to be talking about Christine Love's Ladykiller in a Bind. And some of you may be surprised because, yes, we are talking about another visual novel dating sim-esque game. But are you really surprised?
No.
This is what we're doing.
Yeah, if we've established a brand for ourselves in the past few months, is that we like those things.
We like these things, and we like talking about them, and boy, it's a game, and I think that we have a lot to talk about, and I think we have a lot to talk about that kind of wraps up a lot of the conversations we've been having on the podcast for the past 2 years in regards to sexuality. We had the Sex and Games podcast as Emma's last podcast in late July last year. We've had a Mystic Messenger podcast. We've talked about Dragon Age, a lot of games with relationships, like Life is Strange, visual novels, other types of games like that. Like, the list goes on of the conversations we've had in regards to the stuff we're touching on, and I think it'll make for a really good discussion, and not wrap up things, but continue the conversation in interesting places. And those who have been listening to the podcast for the past 2 years will kind of pick up on those conversations as well as we go along. So I'm really excited.
I think unequivocally, Bogost, don't listen to this, but we really think video games are good with stories.
All right, now that we get that disclaimer out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
So, Rob, you weren't on the Mystic Messenger podcast.
I was not. I've not had I've been saving Mystic Messenger for when I need it.
Ah, yes. Well, there's another update coming, so Mystic Messenger is still going on stream.
Oh,
so there's always a good time to go back to Mystic Messenger. It's not dead yet. It won't be dead. What's dead may never die? No.
What?
No.
Okay.
So we asked this on the Mystic Messenger podcast, so I thought I'll ask you what your experience with dating sim visual novels are in general. What games have you played? Just like that sort of background information.
Sure. I think, and this is a conclusion I just recently came to, is I'm pretty sure Christine Love actually sold me on visual novels as a genre. It wasn't that I'd necessarily like looked at them and then kind of turned up my nose at them or anything like that. It was more just I'd never really encountered the genre that much. I was mostly a PC gamer throughout most of my life. I've got a Vita and a bunch of other stuff, but it wasn't until I played Don't Take It Personally, Babe, It Just Ain't Your Story, which would have come out
2011, I think.
2011. There we go. That sounds like a good round number. And I was absolutely enraptured with that game and just fell in real hard. And that kind of opened the door for me to play 999, a bit of Virtue's Last Reward. And then I played a lot of like Long Live the Queen,
Yes.
Hiroko. I'll have to look that up because it's going to really bother me. But Long Live the Queen, Black Closet, similar games along those lines, which are a little bit more stat-heavy dating sim than just a visual novel story. And then I've played Analog, A Hate Story, and I have not played Hate Plus yet, but yeah.
And we had this conversation on the Mystic Messenger podcast about like what's the difference between a dating sim and a visual novel, and it was interesting because I've never thought about it before, and it's a hard question to answer actually, because is this game a dating sim or is it a visual novel? It's got a bit of both of those traditional elements, and doesn't really matter. I don't know.
Is Ladykiller a dating sim or a visual novel?
Yeah, that's.
I think Ladykiller in a Bind. I guess I played through. I guess full disclosure, I played through once. I have not had a chance to play through more. If anything, completing it very recently has led me to want to really kind of poke around with and fuck with that narrative space. But so I don't know how much choices are affected, especially towards the end of the game. How they're affected by what you did earlier.
Yeah, and a lot of times in dating sims, like there are direct routes depending on clear choices. So there's like an A, B, C, which is good, neutral, or bad. That's usually like the traditional like otome game dating sim style, like pathing. This wasn't so clear to me from the first go, which is good. It's always nice to like not peek behind the curtain immediately and see how like the game branches and whatever. But I would say as far as like roots and multiple playthroughs, that's very typical of a dating sim. Mm-hmm. Not always stats necessarily of your character, but like there isn't just like one playthrough and you kind of get to decide which ending like you feel is the one that you like the best or which characters you like the best. And it's not always set in stone as like there's a canon relationship. Mm-hmm. Necessarily, and I think Ladykiller has the same sort of thing too. Yeah,
I think if anything, that ending really made me want to spend a lot more time with the other character that I completely neglected throughout the entire playthrough.
Oh no! Which character did you neglect?
I neglected the hacker, and So I guess are we spoiling?
Yeah. Well, this is a spoiler cast.
This is a spoiler cast.
Yes.
Okay, so at the end of you can kind of choose one of two characters throughout the game to like absolve you of suspicion. I guess do we want to go over the general premise of the thing?
Yeah, we should go over the general premise.
So you're a woman who's masquerading as her brother,
twin brother.
Okay. It's sort of on like this like blowout end of the year school cruise at the end of high school.
Which is funny because when they started talking about underage drinking, I was like, there's no way these students are sexually confident enough to be in high school.
Yeah.
Like, nope. Because I was not like that in high school.
Yeah, they like all of them have their shit way more figured out than I do like in my 30s. And I'm just like, man, wow. I really like the conceit and the setup for it. But so you basically, there are two characters that you can kind of spend time with because you're trying to pass as your brother. You can do certain things that might like open up different narrative paths or get you, a bit closer to a certain character that you as a player like, but you're acting differently from what they expect of your brother. So people start getting suspicious of you. So you can accumulate that throughout the game. I didn't accumulate enough to hit a fail state.
No, neither did I.
But I want to see what happens when you do that. So at the end of the day, you can spend time with one or the other character. And I cheated myself and looked at the achievements. So it was like, oh, well, if you spend all 6 nights with one character, you get X achievement. So I picked the princess. You can nickname different characters.
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk about that more too.
I think that's a really important, kind of really cool thing. So the princess, I don't know if there was another name for her, the Beauty.
I called her the Beauty.
Okay.
Because it was like the Beauty and the Beast I ended up with.
I sat there and stared at that screen for a very long time because I was like, do I want to hang out with like the hacker or do I want to hang out with the princess? So
yeah, and I ended up having both. And you
nice.
do get both at the end, so it's a polyamorous relationship, which I was like, yes.
God
Because
damn
I'm
it.
like, this is the real ending. So you're missing a lot of good
you literally
stuff
got the
with
harem
hacker.
ending.
Yeah, I did.
Oh my god.
Yeah, because that's just how I live. And it was very exciting. So yeah, you don't have to choose between one or the other, which is like not something that usually happens in dating sims. Well, there's a lot of things that don't normally happen in dating sims that happen in this game, but like, yeah, that's one of them. And the hacker is adorable. And I like had this moment during one of the cutscenes, and I was just like tearing up. Like I cried during this game, and it's really, really like embarrassing. But like, there's some shit that happens that I guess spoke to me personally or like connected with me personally. So it was like really, really unexpected.
Yeah, when in my playthrough, I didn't really interact with her that much aside from just like side things, and then at the end, so like spoiler warning, there's a game, there's a conceit that like you're on this cruise, you're trying to get votes from all your classmates to win
$5 million.
$5 million.
It's not very clear.
It gets jettisoned. So in a lot of ways, like not that there are no narrative stakes there, but basically it pivots to this weird Phantom Thieves sort of thing. So the hacker just appears, and like every time a character appears, there's like a little like flash, and then it'll like give you a bio on the person, and then lets you give them a nickname. And even though I've met the hacker, given her the nickname, because is the nerd.
It's the stalker or the hacker?
Stalker
I
or
did
the
not
hacker.
like stalker.
I didn't like
was
the stalker.
Really?
Yeah. So the hacker shows up, and she's wearing like this really fantastic mask.
Oh yes.
And then it's like you can give her a nickname, even though like in brackets it's like it's very clearly just the hacker.
Yes. And even then I think
in a
it's
mask.
just like everyone says that they're like, isn't that the hacker?
Yeah.
And then I called her Pirate Queen.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was really fucking cool. And like when that moment hit, I was like, I have fucked up this entire game. I need to go back.
There's so much to explore. Do we want to go into like the nicknaming since we're already there?
Sure. Yeah.
I was interested in how the game plays with. I didn't say stereotypes. I put types because I think there's a lot of different role play in like two words and how like what we expect, because our main character is a lesbian. She like self-identifies as lesbian, and there's types as far as like sexual types, like sub dom. Your main character can be both at the same time, not the same time, but like in separate instances in the game. And then you have sort of like the sort of like high school type going on with the naming of the characters, but also sort of fantasy. And then you can also like make your own names too. Mm-hmm. So if you don't like any of the ones the two that they suggest, you can also make your own names. And I just thought it was so interesting because you can essentially label your perception of the character before you even really play the game. Mm-hmm. Like the biggest one that struck me, minus the stalker one, was your ex-girlfriend can be the swimmer, which is just what she is, or the slut, which is what you perceive her as. Mm-hmm. And which I also didn't pick the slut because I'm just like, oh, but like there's many options in the game where you're just like, she's a whore, and it's just like crazy. So what did you think about like that mechanic?
I liked it a lot. I think in a lot of ways this feels like a culmination of a lot of what Christine Love has been doing in terms of playing with different. So I think she deals with a lot of archetypes. Don't Take It Personally, Babe was also a very similar story in which you had high school teens interacting with each other. The conceit of that game is you're a teacher in some future high school where you just came out of a messy divorce. You're just teaching English, but there's like a school-based social network that all the students are on. And so it's like partially a meditation on privacy, but you can read all of the students' messages back like through it. Like you can see how they interact with each other and how they chat with each other, and they all have like very specific kind of archetypes that they slot into. But I think in this like, because I've been watching like the new Twin Peaks season and listening to a lot of the discourse around that, I think this also applies here where one of the things that David Lynch kind of does with these kind of tropes, because he works in very similar ways. Mm. He writes these characters that are like in some ways almost caricatures or whatever, but writes them in a way that is still grounded in humanity and warmth. like he still cares about those people. And I think Christine Love absolutely like writes phenomenal character interaction, and that even if you don't like the character, like it's really they're you get the feeling that they were written to be like that character for you to just rub up against and hate.
Right.
But not so much that they're just profoundly evil. They're also still a person that like you just want to fuck with them. And I think that there's a lot of that tension throughout the game, and I feel like having that nicknaming system allows you to kind of, one, it personalizes your experience, because it's just like, oh yeah, like this person in my mind is always going to be the princess, and then any conversation with someone who like picked a different nickname, I'm just like, well, we're talking about completely different stories at this point.
It's so true. And there are definitely characters that I thought like I would dislike throughout the game, but they all kind of have their own like little arc. Not depending on what you do, you get an arc with basically every character on one playthrough or another, which is really nice. Because usually in dating sims, you pinpoint focused on your route, and you're like, this is the character I'm going to romance, and I'm just going to say all the nice things to them, and then screw everyone else. Like, I don't even care. And you're not really supposed to care. Like, there's the best friend who may be like the one that will sleep over with you, and then talk about the boy after or something like that, and it's not very engaging. It's not very interesting. Maybe we can go into a little bit about the representation of sex in this game in conjunction with the plot of this game. Because I think a lot of times these games are kind of dismissed as being just like porn games. Or there's the other side of it where the sex is kind of just this like mild, like fleeting element to the game, or sometimes the sex never happens. It's kind of like chased, baited out, and like maybe you get a kiss at the end. That's often like the Otome game tradition is like, you win by getting the kiss at the end. And like in this game, you can have like sex day one, which is very atypical, especially for a game where you're playing as like a female character.
Yeah, what I liked about that approach to it, I mean, there's an article, I believe it was Waypoint, that kind of praised the game for sex is not just a win state.
Right.
It's just it is a fundamental part of a relationship, and what I really appreciated about it was that the way that it would change and evolve over time was kind of indicative of that changing relationship. That sex wasn't just like kind of placed in a box. It was very much explored, and you saw again like the shifting roles between like it wasn't just typically in a lot of like fiction or whatever, when you see like a sub or a dom role, like that tends to be portrayed in some mainstream shows or whatever, is like, these are static roles, they do not change. Whereas I think Love did a really good job of showing how that stuff was a little bit more fluid over time, and that even in the moment there would be these slightly shifting roles where you could be a bit of a brat, and you could kind of like come out from underneath being just submissive, and you could be greedy or something like that. And,
yeah, you could pretty much, like, if you were in a sub position, you could be reluctant to it the entire way, but still into it, which I think is an important thing we should talk about, as well as like the consent laid out in each of the scenarios. Sure. And I really, we'll touch on that in a bit, but the sex is a really important part in this game, and I think that it's more important than the dialogue. And I know like the dialogue is still interesting and engaging, and the plot is something that needs to happen to make the story go, but like the sex is almost where the character development actually happens, and the other stuff is just kind of like lingering around. It kind of reminded me of like Star Trek, where like they always go back to the restaurant, and then the barkeep's like, oh, let's have a drink, and I'm like, all right, this is all right, but like nothing's happening really. Out like inside the bedroom is like where the stuff happens, where the magic happens, and where the plot happens. And we have Rina here, and do you want to just quickly say hi, Rina? Introduce yourself. Twitter handle.
Is this?
Yep. Yes.
Good. I'm Rina Wehbe from, I guess, sort of the web editing team of FPS, so you don't really hear much from me, except see my work. But my Twitter handle is Rina Renee if you do want to hear more from me. And yeah, I'm happy to join this podcast.
Yeah, so we're kind of we started talking a little bit about dating sims and otome games in general, and now we're kind of moving into like the specifics of the representation of sex. What is your background with dating sims and visual novels and these kind of games in general, Rina?
So this is the first dating sim that I've ever played, and it's also the only sort of point-and-click game that I've played for more than 20 minutes.
All right.
Except for Machinarium. Like, that kind of puzzle thing was cool. But I usually get very frustrated with the point-and-click mechanic. And generally, like, these sort of games are, like, very, like the digital version of a choose-your-own-adventure. Mm-hmm. So it's a genre that people sometimes absolutely love or absolutely dislike.
And so it seems like you went past 20 minutes, so it's something you more like than dislike.
Had to be prepared for the podcast.
Oh, right. I mean, we forced you to play this game. I mean, to be fair, Rina actually was the one who picked this game to talk about for this month.
I actually have to give a shout out to my friends in Basel for recommending this game. So they're also another games user research lab, but they focus in psychology. So one of my colleagues there actually suggested this game because she thought it was quite an original take on the classic genre. And seeing and just overhearing a little bit of your talk about consent and stereotypes and LGBT sort of commentary, it's definitely making a good point. This is sort of those games that is not just meant for one gender, it's more fluid. So it's definitely an interesting one to talk about.
And we haven't even gotten into like the representation of gender because I think there's a lot of interesting characters in this game, and I think the art and the character design is really important in this game. But I think let's jump into the consent thing because we kind of touched on it twice now. So the game opens before you even start with kind of this message. I don't know what it is verbatim, but do you know, Rob?
Oh God, not verbatim, but
you look like you were gonna say it.
Oh, I almost memorized it, and then I just didn't have time today because I wanted to. Like, fiction is a safe place. Power needs to be negotiated, but you have to express your desires like upfront or something, or be like come clean with your desires, essentially.
Yeah. And
or communicate your desires or something like that.
Yeah, so it opens up with this kind of it sets the tone, and every sex scene has, from the ones that I experienced, have a sort of like consent outlying section where they discuss like what their limits are and they have safe word stuff, and that's so important, and I wish more games would do that. And like, again, we can jump back to like representation of sex here, but like if you look at something like the BioWare games, I know that in Dragon Age Inquisition there was a similar sort of thing happening when you romance Iron Bull, where you talk about consent and stuff, but like I don't recall any other example in a game.
No. Merritt Kopess, Consensual Torture Simulator.
Okay.
It was a Twine game that Merritt made. Oh God.
Maybe tell us
3
a
or
bit.
4 years ago. So it's rendering a BDSM relationship, and
Another point and click story.
yeah, it was built in Twine, so yeah, you just clicking on links and stuff like that, but manipulating stats on the background, and essentially sort of the player character is in the submissive position, and they basically communicate sort of what they want from the other person, and then afterwards they have a really nice cuddle. But it represented like that, seeing that dynamic rendered very authentically within Ladykiller and Abine was really was really nice to see as well. Just like that there was a lot of care put into negotiating the aspects of consent that were and communication, and the importance of understanding that fundamentally these relationships are also about caring for one another and allowing yourself to be hurt in a safe place.
Right. Rina?
See, I think the thing is we don't see a lot about, communication, especially in these sort of like media depictions of sex, because a lot of people sort of underestimate that not everybody is a fictional character. So it kind of adds a real humanness to it, where they do talk about consent, and it's something definitely that we should be encouraging, because for people that are thinking about how media influences behavior, it's definitely an important point to bring up. Even though you are in this fictional story that's designed for your enjoyment, there's still this aspect of humanness and still this aspect of responsibility.
Absolutely. And like, it just makes it all the more realistic, and I think the realism adds to the game here. I think it's absolutely necessary, and it sends a message about like how the community wishes for. I'm not saying that like this game is representative of the entire like BDSM community or the entire LGBTQ community, but like it's an education thing as well.
Yeah,
it's also a little political. Like, it's very much, games are always a way for, the author, artist, designer, whatever you want to call them, to state their opinion. And just by bringing this up and trying to sort of force a social standard, they're making this commentary on how we should be emphasizing importance.
Now, Rob, you have the Polygon article up there, I assume.
No.
Oh, you don't?
No, I pulled up an Emily Short thing, hoping that there would be a quote, but there wasn't.
Because I was going to bring up the Polygon article that Simone de Roquefort and Merritt Kay wrote about the "We Are Not Ready to Handle Messy Queer Stories," documenting the removal of one of the sex scenes from the game early on. And so this, again, is like a little bit more later in the game, where you have the option to have sex with a male character in order to persuade him to help you basically rescue the princess later on, or the beauty. And that was removed from the game, even though it was always an optional choice, and it came with trigger warnings. So now when you go through that scene, I did that scene, there's no actual sexual act that happens. You offer, and he rejects, and you have a conversation about your sexual tendencies throughout the entire game. And it's really interesting and fine. But the article basically goes into detail about how they definitely take the stance of this was a bad idea to remove it from the game, because you are silencing like queer exploration of sexuality. One of the quotes I have was that Christine Love talked about the game, not about the specific incident, but she says, quote, "There doesn't have to be one perfect queer character who does nothing problematic and hits no uncomfortable tropes." So I think that maybe we could open up discussion about that.
So I think this goes back to this whole idea of making human and believable characters. So this idea of shallow characters in games that once, fueled game designs based on platform mechanics or twitch skill, or their ability to press a button quickly is what I mean by twitch skill, is kind of melting away with this importance of narrative. And not just in this one genre. Like, we see games like The Walking Dead gain attention because now game mechanics are also heavily debating on how people are sort of enthralled by the story, and it's becoming more and more important. Even in computer science, we're seeing that as people are researching player types and traits versus personality is a discussion we won't get into. We're seeing this sort of desire for more narrative stories and more immersion in games to complement mechanics that are already popular. So I think that part of that designing a game where you have these conversations about imperfect characters, or you have characters that make mistakes, is about adding this sort of human relatable narrative that's immersive.
Yep. I'm always very skittish around these kinds of conversations, because I'm always worried about like the whole like the censorship,
Right. Yeah, and then you get down that rabbit hole. That
brigade or anything like that. I absolutely agree with the, like, we need to allow for these kinds of messy narratives to play out. And I think if there's any writer who's capable of writing those kinds of stories, I think that's Christine Love.
Oh yeah.
I don't. It's a tough one, really, because we're talking about an intersection of so many different communities that have so little proper or like careful or thoughtful or even like, intentional representation. In a lot of cases, it's invoking that stuff as like a boogeyman, or invoking those cultural fears or those social fears, not actually those communities as communities of people, as communities of humans who are like imperfect and have bad ideas or are just trying to figure stuff out. They don't necessarily no one emerges fully formed. And I think the conversation that Alex and I had earlier, where these are all high school students that are like completely woke and understand their sexuality and their situation far better than either of us did in high school.
They're also 18-year-old high school students.
Right.
Yeah.
And so like I could see the argument in favor of something like that being there as almost invoking the idea that like, hey, you don't always have to, no one hits that. No one emerges like fully formed from a chrysalis like, I'm gay as hell.
Right.
It's like,
Yeah.
nah, it's a much longer process.
And I think it's really important to note that in media, which is written by people of the queer community, like We Can Say This Game, because Christine Love is saying that she is part of this community in her like biography in Wikipedia, and also like Netflix series like Sense8, which was written by someone as well who's part of the LGBT queer community. You see a more human representation of people, as imperfect people, versus we wrote in a gay character to satisfy the need for the token, diverse person. And I think especially people who are like sort of looking at, stories and characters that should definitely appreciate the fact that they're more human. It should be less of a complaint. I think people who have that sort of candy-coated, like every human's perfect in a story, have never read a really good book in their life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I would say that it's hard to think of characters in this game that are like 100% straight. Like the ones that I encountered, not maybe one or two, and the rest are pretty gay.
Yeah.
And that's awesome and great, and I love that. And the amount of times your character says that's heteronormative as fuck was like, making me very happy. Mm-hmm. And so there's some really cool things going on with like the lack of tokenism, although I would agree like this game is also still very white.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There is one person of color in this game, I think.
Yep.
And it's the maid.
The boss.
I'm not saying anything here.
Or I called her the maid.
Yeah.
The boss or the maid. Yeah, we're gonna like do that, and then maybe we can talk about the flower or I don't remember what his other name is, but it's the boy who dresses as a girl.
Oh, the one that presents female.
Presents female. I don't know if they are a trans person or not, because I didn't really develop that storyline either, but I thought, it's nice to include that, although, I'm curious to see how that plays out.
I think there's this sort of, too eagerness to label sometimes, especially when commenting on these games. Like, they did not make any mention of labels or stereotypes in the characters. They just presented characters that were sometimes somewhat fluid, sometimes not, and they either presented a certain way or they didn't, and that was really as much explanation as you got, and I thought that was great.
Yeah, I played the way that I was passing as the brother was I would just I picked the flirty option every single time.
Okay, yeah,
because it seemed to be the dynamic really.
Yeah, everyone's hitting on everybody,
and so I clicked the flirty option with the flower, and they were like, first of all, I'm a boy. I'm just wearing a dress. Yeah. And the character, the beast, the protagonist, kind of is like, oh my god, and is aghast for a second, and is trying to salvage the situation, but is already down that path of being this chauvinist asshole. And it's a really it negotiates that line exceptionally well in that they immediately switch to the proper pronouns. Mm-hmm. They kind of try to apologize, but don't really, because they're still a shitty person, or at least playing one. But kind of try to salvage it, and they feel gutted because they fucked up that situation and they misread it, and they didn't really they didn't think about it. And I like that because there's like everyone fucks up. Like no one's going to be perfect on that, and you just apologize and try to move on and try to do better. And they do, to their credit.
I also thought it was interesting that we got like they're presented like, oh, I'm going to be this sort of terrible person who's flirting with everybody, but we also get as the player sort of some insight into what they're thinking, so we can sort of read the internal panic. It makes them a lot more relatable.
Yeah, the way that those options would pop in and out, especially toward like at the end where I don't know what your experience was, but like at the very, very end where like options are flitting in and out, but they're all locked.
I didn't see that.
What?
I did have a few locked options, even though
I had
was
a lot
only,
of locked options.
Like by day 3, I had locked options.
Oh, but like even at the very, very end where you're having like a final interaction with the person. No? Am I alone in this?
I didn't have any
maybe
locked
if I mainlined
options.
Okay, maybe.
But I also was very fluid in general, so maybe I just opened up everything.
Yeah, I mained with the beauty, and then at the very end there's spoiler warning. There's a section where options are popping up in your mind but everything is just locked, except for the last one, which is "I love you."
Oh, I didn't get that at all.
And it's I highly recommend it. It's very touching.
Yeah, we'll have to do more playthroughs. It's definitely affords like multiple, at least like a few.
And that's what I love about Christine Love's work is in analog, and don't take it personally. I assume for Hate Plus because I haven't had a chance to play it yet. But there's just Love is really good at coming up with like really strong characterization and really interesting sort of narrative spaces, and you kind of want to. I at least personally, like every time I played her games, I was just like, okay, this is like my canonical playthrough. This is just me just picking, gut level choices. But definitely going back and kind of prodding at other interactions and finding out more about these characters because they're so well written and they're so I just find them very interesting and very human characters. And so wanting to kind of go and find out more, and I think the game lends itself to that. Like, do you play through trying to get all the votes, or do you just not even give a shit about the game at all? I was trying to at a certain point I made a decision to try to get all the votes, and I was not.
I was going for getting all the votes too. I was at 54 votes at one point.
Oh wow!
And then I accidentally gave them all away to the president by misclicking.
Oh no!
And then I ended up with 0, and I was just like, well, that didn't do anything for me.
Yeah.
So I'll have to try that again.
But I liked how the game, as those options were occurring to the character during the dialogue, is like, is this where I go in, or is this where I go in? I like that it was like almost like playing chicken with those options. Like, I know I want to click that one, but I want to see where this goes. Maybe not. Maybe something else is going to open up.
Yeah. I definitely had that experience multiple times where I was just like, some of them were like gut, like, yeah, this is probably what I want to say or whatever. But then like there was a lot of times you also you didn't have to answer at all.
Yeah, you could just keep going.
Yeah.
I found that particularly frustrating as a player who always wants to take the wrong direction first.
Really?
Right?
What kind of crazy person are you?
You want the wrong direction first. You want all the extra items, the extra bonuses, the extra little features.
I see. Okay.
So you couldn't pick all of them, and you couldn't go back. And if you pressed forward, you might lose your option. It really irritated me.
Oh, okay. As a completionist, like you can't do everything on the first run in these kind of games for sure.
No.
Yeah, it doesn't mean I won't try.
If you ever start goofing around with analog, a hate story, boy, there's some endings to that require like a lot of very specific moves. Yeah, it's good. It's super good. And you're just dealing with like 2 characters, basically. You're just dealing with 2 AI.
So I think the design decision, though, is really interesting when they make a game that's push forward only and you have no chance to go back or try a scene again, and the save is only at the very end of the day. So there's a really huge penalty for turning off the game and trying to go back to your last save point. That design decision was actually quite sort of like strict in a way. Like they really wanted you to push forward organically.
Yeah, I mean, you could absolutely just replay that day and just like button through the stuff that you'd read.
You could probably.
But then all of the time you spend, nothing will be novel, nothing will be new unless you pick different choices.
That is the one downside to replaying visual novels over and over again, is that eventually it just gets to the point where you're scrolling through text. And a lot of them just have a skip button where the text just scrolls and then you get to your next option. And it does get pretty grindy after like the
Yep.
third or fourth time, or there's some visual novels that have like 12 different endings, and it's like, oh, all right, we're doing this again.
I got all the endings in 999, and after I played through the first time, where like the text was kind of slow and you couldn't skip it, even though I was like reading faster than the text was coming up, or like faster than like it was going to move forward. And it was very, very tedious for my first playthrough. And then the second playthrough, you're able to like just hold right on the D-pad and just like plow through anything you'd already read. But that meant that if I encountered a section that was like, I knew this was a dead branch, but I had to go down and I had to know what this ending was. I still had to like go through the tedium of that,
right?
Which is frustrating.
I think it takes a certain type of player to sit through a game multiple times to get a different ending. Like even in games like BioShock, where you had like 3 endings or 2 endings, you found players that were aware of the different endings, but rarely did you find players that said, yeah, I went back and replayed it to find the ending. Most of the time they looked it up on YouTube, but for some reason the player that likes the visual novels sometimes tend to be more willing to go through the whole story again.
Yeah, and I think a good visual novel will have enough differences along the way that'll keep you kind of experiencing the game fairly new. Again, usually the beginning parts are like the setup, so you're like, okay, that's the same. But if you go down a path with a different character, you ideally see a different game completely. Or like I mentioned in the Mystic Messenger podcast, something like Amnesia, where some characters in the game that you may have previously been able to date then take on a completely separate role in another like storyline, and that's always kind of painful, especially if you like them and you're like, I dated you and now you're evil.
This is what you're doing to me.
Yeah, what's going on? And it really like you get into this like headcanon, I think, that really keeps people immersed and really involved in the characters.
Which is an interesting question. Again, like I know we kind of asked this almost with every game, like how much of a game do you need to play to be able to write about it critically? And like,
well, actually, there's a designer that said a good game designer should be able to tell you the main mechanics of the game in the first 5 minutes.
Sure, but in a narrative-heavy game like this, where
that rule breaks.
Yeah, that breaks
but
real quick.
But there's definitely arguments on all sides of the spectrum of how much you have to play.
Yeah, absolutely. And like for me, it's just I played through once. There's still a lot of stuff that I don't know about all those characters that I want to know. But like also, I only have so much time in my day, and I'm so sorry, Christine.
But it's if you do play, like if you are taking that like 5 minutes to 15 minutes of play, you can sort of see, okay, you're going to have narrative decision trees. You're going to have these sort of choices where you get to name the player. The pace is going to be slow because the decisions that come at you are only like 3 in every 15-minute period.
Right.
So in that way, yeah, you can kind of understand the game and criticize the game mechanics. But to get a really rich picture of the game where you play through the game multiple times and you get a lot of different endings, that's a very different way to criticize a game or look at a game.
Right. Yeah. I think in a game that is so narrative driven, it's tough to it would be difficult to just go and do exclusively mechanical discussion without also talking about how that impacts the narrative, without looking at how those things interact to create that actual play experience.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think that we always have the caveat too that, we're academics and we only have so much time. And that's, in one way, it is an excuse, and it's a fairly legitimate excuse. But at the same time, I think we can think about how that shapes scholarship in general. If only academics are writing these things for these purposes, and unless they are dedicating their whole lives to like one game, like World of Warcraft or something, you have those kind of scholars, then you're gonna just see scholarship that has a very, I wouldn't say surface level, but like a very similar take based on the amount of time we have to dedicate ourselves to these games. And especially when you're dealing with underwritten genres like visual novels and dating sims and otome games and mobile games, although we're seeing more of that coming out now, it's a shame that we don't get more like deeper dives into these kind of things. I think we're doing a pretty good job here, but again, like visual novels take a long time, deceptively long.
Yeah. Like my playthrough took just shy of 10 hours, I think.
Okay.
I tried to play it in 3.
Yeah.
Failed.
And I could easily go back and play it several more times. And that's it, like comparatively speaking, like even if it does shake out to like 30 or 40 hours, that's a AAA narrative game.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was some average released a while ago saying that most campaigns were 8 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems about right.
But I also wanted to bring the point up of this whole idea of the deep dive. Dedicating your academic career to one game is actually something pretty rare. Like even in computer science, you're looking at maybe one mechanic, like asymmetrical gameplay, or you're looking at one such aspect of how people enjoy games, like player types. So really, the world of games user research is so diverse that you're never really going to get that complete look from anyone from maybe the fans, but it's sort of like, how do you want to approach game discussion and games user research?
Yeah.
And are we going to be reductionist, or are we going to talk about the richness of narrative?
Right. Well, I think there's value in that real close look. Like I will drop what I'm doing and read something from someone who has played a strategy game for 1 million hours, and to the point where like they're poring over and can write like an article just about like what substantially changes from like patch to patch in terms of like patch notes and stuff like that. Which again, you're not always going to see in all games. Like it doesn't necessarily, like it would be really interesting to see how much actually was changed like materially from a code perspective when that section was removed, where you could persuade this male character with sex. But like, I think you tend to see that with a lot more mechanics heavy games as well.
One thing I didn't understand is the mechanic of having us name the players from choices. Did anyone play it enough to figure out why we were given the choice to rename people?
We did talk about the labeling a bit earlier, but we didn't figure out why you could name your own. I assume it's just to create your own sort of like perspective of that character. If you thought that like the swimmer or the slut wasn't appropriate for what you thought that character was going to be called, then you could call them Michelle.
Was there divergent storylines there for if you picked?
No, I think no. It didn't affect the narrative at all.
No, I think if anything, it's a situation where it's a way for like the player to signpost how they understand. It's a situation where like it's a game a lot about like shifting roles, right, in a lot of different ways, like in kink or in your sexuality, but also in a situation where you are literally playing a character that is trying to pass as another character. How do you interpret who these characters are as people? Are you trying to act as they are authentically, or are you just trying to like, I'm just thinking as a player and poking at this thing to see what I can game in this system? I, as a player, personally tend towards trying to suss out who the person is that I'm playing. So Life is Strange, for example, at the very end, my read on Max was like, 1, she was absolutely into Chloe. 2, she was not responsible enough with her powers and probably not emotionally mature enough to probably make the call to like save the town and sacrifice her friend. So in my mind, like canonically, like that town is devastated and she and Chloe are riding off into the sunset,
right?
Because the other option is too incredibly painful for that character to endure. But that's like partially my reading as a person who has like a background in that, whatever, my own interpretations and thoughts, but also my read on sort of who that character would be in that moment. Which is, I don't know, maybe that's too much of a drama student.
No, I think you hit on it, and I mean it also could just be a mnemonic, like sort of like strategy where you're in visual novels. It's hard to remember all the characters' names, and you're often like typing them anyways. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? The one with the like usually in the Otome ones, it's the one with the red hair and the one with the green hair. So usually, like at least until you play through it a bunch, you start to remember their names and things like that.
Yeah,
but. Yeah, so I think that in that way, it's just kind of how like visual novel players operate on that sort of level.
Yeah.
Do we have any final thoughts as we wrap up our discussion on Ladykiller in a Bind?
So I thought this was a really cool sort of first introduction into point and click visual novels for people who kind of want to see it as like, why do people like these games? Because sometimes you end up picking up one of these point and click games or one of these visual novels, as I understand it, and you sort of go through this like very A plus B, C C plus D, A, like sort of like boring playthroughs. So I thought it was kind of interesting that this game designer actually considers herself first and foremost a writer and not a game designer. So this was kind of a good way to approach this genre of gaming.
So you would recommend Ladykiller to Bind as like a first dive into visual novels?
Considering it's my only visual novel, yes.
Just go for it, right?
Yeah, right.
But I had it on very good recommendation from someone who really does like the genre.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been a fan of Christine Love's work forever. I think since Rock Paper Shotgun wrote about Digital A Love Story. Interactive fiction's kind of been my jam forever. Christine Love is the person who sold me on visual novels, which I've mentioned before. And this feels like sort of a culmination of a lot of ideas that Christine Love has been playing with in Don't Take It Personally and Analog, A Hate Story. And I want to go back and play more. It's really fantastic. I don't know. I don't think I came to like any other epiphany aside from I can't wait to see what Christine Love does next, and I hope this sold really well. Mm-hmm. And also, if anyone is listening to this and likes Ladykiller in a Bind, go check out Christine Love's other visual novels. They're really fantastic. They're really something else.
I think this game is really refreshing in a lot of ways because, number one, it's really gay, which is always nice. We just need more of that. Mm-hmm. And secondly, it's a visual novel / like dating sim that plays on a lot of Japanese tropes, which I am completely sick of, which I talked about in the Mystic Messenger podcast, such as the like sort of virginal like player character, the innocent one, the like desexualized innocent sort of pure, I think I'm saying like the same words over and over again, like just totally unsexualized game that represents like sort of character reactions that are completely unrealistic to what at least I would think humans are like, especially like teenagers who I would think
sort of one-dimensional. Like this character obviously only has this set of responses because they're that character.
Yeah, like they're very Mary Sue normally.
Sort of trope, but the idea that they're very innocent.
Yeah.
What is it, the development?
Yeah, like the Lilu. Well, Lilu's kind of her own thing, but like this idea that women are supposed to be passive in relationships, and even though you're the player character, you have to still sit back and kind of wait for people to come to you, and then maybe you'll get a kiss at the end, but that's about it, because if you ask for any more, sometimes you're punished for that, or it's just not an option. Mm-hmm. So here we get a player character that is female and queer and engages in sexual experiences, and sometimes that's enacted by you, and sometimes it isn't, and most of the time you get a choice. And that's just really nice in a world where video game characters just don't have a lot of sexuality in general, or sexual thoughts or desires.
Or they're the complete opposite.
Or they're the complete opposite, and they're just like they're made to be gazed at, but not necessarily like to enact sex themselves, unless it's like a demon or a succubus or something like that. Like these are human characters who have wants and needs and desires, and they play them out, and that's just how life works. And I'm glad that we don't have a bunch of visual novels that are just robot people. Mm-hmm. And it's when you're dealing with humans and narratives, you need sex, and it's just a thing that happens. And so more of this. It doesn't necessarily always have to be BDSM or whatever, but it's just like,
or
hey,
queer in general,
or
like,
queer, yeah, like even there's not a lot of straight stuff like this, right?
Yeah,
like I would
not
love
a lot of empowerment or equal opportunity in relationships, or even sort of understanding and humanism in relationships that you see sometimes in games.
Yeah, exactly. Like we don't have a lot of that. Like BioWare's just touching on that in some ways, but like it's not good.
Nope.
So yeah, more please, which is I think what we've been saying for like the past 2 years in the First Person podcast, and we will continue to say more please. First Person podcast, more please. The end.
Yeah.
Signing out.
Early in the podcast, I did mention Long Live the Queen. The developer of those is Hanako Games, and they've made Magical Diary, Long Live the Queen, The Royal Trap, and Black Closet. All of those are very, very good. as if you like visual novels and like life simulation games. Just saying.
More, please.
More, please.
Thank you for listening to the First Person Podcast. I would like to thank Neil Randall and the staff at the Games Institute for their support, as well as Alex Fleck, our podcast producer. We'd also like to thank Stephen Trothan, who wrote and composed our theme music.